In this series of videos, I want to address some issues that come up in DBH's second meditation, which is an extended discussion on the concept of judgment and what it is as he understands it. So he begins by noting how the New Testament, or in the New Testament, there is employed metaphorical imagery, and that is the primary mode of communicating the reality of the state of the condemned. So if you have your book, go ahead and grab it, because I'm going to give a quote on page 93, and it is on this page where he mentions that, quote, metaphors of destruction, like the annihilation of chaff or brambles in ovens, or the final death of body and soul in the valley of Hinnom, Gehenna. Others are metaphors of exclusion, like the sealed doors of wedding feasts. A very few, are images of imprisonment and torture. But even then, in the relevant verses, those punishments are depicted as having only a limited term, unquote. Now, of course, after this quote, he gives a list of scripture passages that he thinks support his case here. But the point that DBH seems to want to make, that he wants to make, is that when it comes to these metaphorical images of the judgment, many Christians take them literally, all the while they take the more universalist passages non-literally. So he complains about this, and he says on page 94 that, quote, to me, it is surpassingly strange that down the centuries, most Christians have come to believe that one class of claims, all of which are allegorical, pictorial, vague, and metaphorical in form, must be regarded as providing the literal content of the New Testament's teaching regarding the world to come, while another class, all of which are invariably straightforward, doctrinal statements, must be regarded as mere hyperbole. So in essence, he thinks that it's a strange state of affairs that many Christians are in, and namely one that allows Christians to take the more allegorical texts and grant them literal content, all the while taking those texts that are, quote, straightforward doctrinal statements and treating them like the wind. He thinks that most Christians do not take enough care in crafting their interpretations of hell. He says, for example, quite pointedly on pages 94 and 95, he says, quote, we can see that the ovens are metaphors, and the wheat and the chaff, and the angelic harvest, and the barred doors, and the debtors' prisons. So why do we not also recognize that the deathless worm and the inextinguishable fire, and all other such images, none of which, again, means quite what the infernalist imagines, are themselves mere figural devices within the embrace of an extravagant apocalyptic imagery that in itself has no strictly literal elements? How did some images become mere images in the general Christian imagination, while others became exact documentary portraits of some final reality? Okay, so there are a couple of things I want to say about these statements and about these quotes, okay? First, I actually agree with him, or agree with his basic point here, namely that many Christians don't think coherently or even biblically about the final state of hell, and more specifically, they don't employ sound interpretive methods when it comes to understanding these texts in the New Testament that talk about hell. So, for example, many Christians do talk of hell as if it really is, or literally is, a fire for all eternity, right? You are, I'm sure, quite familiar with this. But of course, that might be problematic. Now, before I get to reasons why, it's important to understand why a lot of Christians think hell is a literal fiery place. They base their belief on such passages as Matthew 18:9, where Gehenna is described as fire, or in Mark 9:48, where hell is described as fire that is not quenched. Another place would be Matthew 13, verse 42, where the place of weeping and gnashing of teeth is a place that is described as a fiery furnace. So, perhaps it is quite understandable why people who believe in hell, many Christians who believe in hell, think it's a place of fire, because the text says it is. Well, I'm not so sure the text says it is, as it is their interpretation is saying that it is. See, the problem with a strict literal approach to verses like these is that they don't work if they're applied across the board, okay? At least without any qualification given. So, for example, we see in Matthew chapter 8, verse 12, that the place of weeping and gnashing of teeth is a place of outer darkness. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because these are, as DBH has said, clearly metaphors and not literal descriptions of what such a place will look like. Now, the reason I say this is because if we fail to see these passages as metaphors, and hence if we fail to interpret them appropriately, then we might end up with some very weird results. So for example, let's suppose that we take the biblical descriptions of this mysterious place described as a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. Let's suppose we take that in a literal way. Then which is it? Is that a place of strictly speaking, outer darkness, or is it a place of fire? I mean, it can't be both, right? Because a place lit up with fire is not going to be a very dark place at all. And a place of darkness will not, by definition at least, be a lit up place. Now, of course, we could simply say that the New Testament is contradicting itself. But then again, this seems completely unlikely for numerous reasons, one of which is Matthew is the one who gives these two different descriptions, right? And had he meant for them to be taken literally, it seems like that he would have caught his own blunder, not least when we consider that these two descriptions occur just 5 chapters apart. Okay, so the skeptic who would say, they're just contradicting itself. That doesn't work. It seems to me that there is another more plausible option here. This option would be just to simply take these passages as metaphorical pictures, not literal descriptions of the final state of the wicked. So, I think we should tip our hat to DBH and others like him who helpfully push back against very surface level exegesis that, sad to say, all too often happens in our churches, not least conservative evangelical ones. And I say this with utmost respect. I'm an evangelical, right? So I'm not pointing fingers at other people. I am in that tribe. Okay, so but again, we should tip our hat to those who push us to think more coherently. I should also say that when it comes to these metaphors, I am quite certain that one would be hard-pressed to find a New Testament scholar who does not recognize these who doesn't recognize these images as primarily metaphorical in nature. So what I mean is that no scholar that I know of, at least, believes that there is a literal worm, say 2 or 3 feet long, who will live in hell forever, nipping away at the damned. So DBH knows that this is the case, and I don't take him to mean to say that New Testament scholars do think like that way. They don't think like that at all. What I think DBH is saying is that there are New Testament scholars who, even while they don't take every facet of the metaphors literally, they still nonetheless take some facets of these metaphorical images literally. Specifically, he thinks they take those parts in the New Testament that seem to speak of hell as eternal torment, they take those too literally, right? And he's going to say that's not a good thing to do. So at this point, I think I need to offer a pushback ever so gently to DBH, right? So his whole point in this discussion is that many Christians do not take the sum total of those metaphors or these metaphorical pictures appropriately. He thinks that if he can get Christians to begin to take these pictures metaphorically instead of completely literally, then he might possibly be able to convince them that their so-called infernalist position is wrong. While I do think, as I've said, it is right for him to push back here in many ways, I'm not too convinced that this by itself will help his cause much, okay? So let me explain what I mean. Well, in his discussion about how these passages of hell in the New Testament are metaphors, so page 93 and following, in that area he makes the comment that even in those cases where images of imprisonment and torture are employed, he says that, quote, those punishments are depicted as having only a limited term. He says this on page 93, 94, 95, right? Examples that he cites are places like Matthew 5:36. Although I need to say, in his book, that's the reference he gives, Matthew 5:36. But I think it's a typo. I think he meant to say Matthew 5:26. At any rate, he also gives passages such as Matthew 18:34, and there's a passage in Luke 12. Now, I do think it's true that Matthew 18:33 to 35, I think that passage does employ an image of temporary punishment, right? Well, I should say that seems to employ an image of temporary punishment. So this is the parable of the unforgiving servant, and it's well known. So let me read it. It says that, and should not, this is Matthew 18:33-35. It says, and should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant, as I had mercy on you? And in anger his master delivered him to the jailers, until, Heos, he should pay all his debt. So also, hutos kai, so also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. So, again, this passage, especially in verse 34, seems to speak of a temporary punishment. At least that's what DBH is going to say. The master delivered him over to the jailers until Heos, he paid all of his debt. So it seems to imply some sort of temporary time period when it comes to the judgment, right? But here's the deal. If these images, such as the one I've just read, these images, these parables, if they are, as DBH says, precisely that, images, that is to say metaphorical images, well then what permits him to take this particular facet of the image of punishment as limited duration in a literal, straightforward manner? I mean, look, it seems to me that, and I say this quite humbly, I'm not trying to be, I'm not trying to push back with critical tone, but I am trying to push back critically, if that makes sense. But it does seem to me that he can't criticize too heavily those infernalists who understand these metaphors with partial literalness, if he's doing the same thing, because even he looks to these passages and takes some of the parts of these passages in a literal way. For example, he points out how, look, this literally means a limited duration. Well, if these are just metaphorical images, then what permits you to take that part literally and not all of it metaphorically? And so again, let me repeat this. I don't think he can criticize too heavily those infernalists, right? Those people who believe in eternal hell. You can't criticize them when they understand these metaphors with partial literalness. If again he's doing the same thing, I just think it's inconsistent.